The Retroid Pocket 3 Plus was arguably the best T618 handheld, and that's saying a lot because we saw that chip make its way to a lot of devices. But while that was a great handheld, the T618 didn't really bridge the gap between the high-end Android handhelds and the wave of arcade 3566 devices we got last year. I thought the next wave of mid-tier handhelds was going to be using the Helio G99 or maybe the D900, but Retroid surprised all of us by putting a D1100 on the new Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. That's a serious jump for the price and the new benchmark for this category. So let's take a look at what the new Retroid Pocket 4 Pro has to offer and see if it's right for you. First, as always, let's take a look at the price and the specs. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro retails for $189 USD plus shipping and is available in 6 colors: 16-bit, black, 16-bit US, watermelon, ice blue, and crystal. It runs on Android 13, has a MediaTek Dimensity 1100 octa-core CPU, a G77 MC9 GPU, 8GB of LPDDR4X RAM, 128GB of internal storage plus an SD card slot for expansion, a 4.7-inch 1334 by 750 IPS screen, a 5000 mAh battery that ranges from 2 to 8 hours of playtime depending on how hard you push it. Things like Super Nintendo and PlayStation 1 are going to get you closer to that 8-hour mark, but demanding PS2, Gamecube, and some Switch titles will really drain that battery. This is unfortunately one of its weak areas. I would have loved to have seen a 6000 mAh battery, but I'm not sure there was a lot of room left for it. It has fast charging, and using a 45-watt charger, it goes from 10 to 50% in 30 minutes and to 100% in a little over an hour. 720p video out over HDMI and 1080p via USB-C. Active cooling, analog L2R2, Hall effect analog sticks, Bluetooth 5.2, and Wi-Fi 6. Of course, these are the specs for the Pro model, and Retroid did release a base model with a D900 and 4GB of RAM. But I think the extra 50 USD is more than worth it for what the Pro has to offer, especially when you see how the chips compare. In every test, the D1100 outperforms the D900 in single and multi-core performance. That's not to say the base RP4 is a bad option, or the Odin Pro for that matter, but considering the price difference and the performance gap, the 4 Pro just makes the most sense. I got the 16-bit model, and while I'm not a big fan of the Skittle buttons, I have to say I don't mind them too much since they have more of a matte color to them, but I'll probably swap them out soon. The color looks very similar to the retro color of the 3 Plus, but the texture is a little different. It has more of a gritty feel that I like. For all that it can do, it's pretty compact, so to help you get a better idea of the size, let's compare it to some other popular handhelds. First up, we have the 3 Plus and the 2S. It's a little bit bigger than the 2S and just slightly bigger than the 3 Plus, but unless you have both in your hands, you wouldn't really notice it. Up next, the AYN Odin Pro and the Odin 2. Both of these are going to be bigger, and it's funny to think that the 4 Pro outperforms the Odin Pro by a good margin while being a good amount smaller. And finally, we have the Steam Deck OLED and the Switch OLED. Both of these are considerably bigger and arguably very different devices, but I think more people are familiar with these two, so it helps get a good perspective of the size of the 4 Pro. It's impressive that Retroid managed to add active cooling and analog triggers while keeping the device so slim. The overall feeling in the hand is good, but could be better. What I mean by that is, it feels good to hold and feels like a premium device, but having a flat back with analog triggers makes it a little bit awkward to hold sometimes. This by no means keeps me away from using them or less likely to play games that heavily rely on them, but it makes me want to pick up a grip for longer play sessions. The D-pad's still the same Vita style D-pad that we've come to expect, but it feels a little bit tighter with less travel than the one of the 3 Plus. It's by no means a bad D-pad, it's still very precise and has that soft click that a lot of people love, but if you're coming from the 3 Plus or the 2S, you're going to notice a slight difference. The analog sticks are a huge improvement, and as somebody who loves having the D-pad in the top position, I'm very happy to see them keep that bottom layout. We've seen these sticks on the 2S and the Odin 2, they're taller than Switch joysticks, have more travel, and feel smoother. They're also Hall effect sticks, so we don't really have to worry about drift. The face buttons, in my opinion, have been improved. They're still using a rubber membrane, but they're not as hard to press while still having a nice tactile feel to them. They're also a little bit bigger, which is nice because I was not a fan of the size of the 3 Plus's buttons. Start, Select, Back, and Home are in a place that makes sense and have a nice soft click to them. While I would have preferred Start and Select above the D-pad and face buttons, having them on the front of the device is a huge improvement. The addition of the back button is also great for navigation and emulators, but unfortunately we don't have any function buttons. Luckily, the back key can be mapped as a hotkey enabled in RetroArch, so if you're used to using the usual Linux hotkey setup, you can replicate that here. The shoulder buttons feel great, even though personally I'm not a fan of the clicky sound, but that's 100% a personal preference. They have a softer click, so it's not too bad, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to love them. The analog triggers have a good amount of resistance and travel. They feel smooth with no grinding sensation. All of the shoulder buttons have a texture to them that doesn't really do much for grip, but it does look really good aesthetically. Other than that, we have our dual speakers, headphone jack, SD card slot, and USB-C at the bottom. Thankfully, nothing on the sides. On the back, we have an intake vent and the Retroid logo. And on the top, we have a micro HDMI port, exhaust vent, volume rocker, and power button. Up next, we're going to test the speakers, and this might be loud, so adjust your volume accordingly.
More of a gaming system experience. Now, before I get into that though, I just want to say that as far as setup, this is one of the easiest Android handhelds to set up because I can get the most
The speakers are loud and very clear, although it is a little unfortunate that they're downfiring. It would have been great to see front-firing speakers, but I guess it's not a huge deal since your hands do a good job of redirecting the sound when you're holding it. Next up, we're going to take a look at the fan, but before we open it up, let's see how loud it can get. First up, with no fan. Quiet mode. Smart mode. And sport mode. Hopefully this gives you a good idea of how loud it can get. And now let's open it up. Now that it's opened up, we can see that there wasn't a whole lot of room for a bigger battery since the heatsink takes up a large chunk of the surface area. Like we heard earlier, the fan is loud in high performance mode, and we unfortunately have to use it a lot for the more demanding games. There seems to be a big gap between performance and high performance, and we can't set the fan to quiet using the highest settings. To get a better idea of how much the fan is actually helping, I ran a few games with the fan unplugged in high performance mode. Unfortunately, I messed up the footage on that, but for PS2, temperatures stayed at about 50 to 52 degrees Celsius. With Yuzu running Bayonetta at half resolution, we had 60 Celsius, and with Genshin Impact at medium settings and 60 FPS, temperatures stayed at about 62 degrees Celsius. Once I reconnected the fan, Genshin dropped down to an average of 52 to 54 Celsius. So yes, the fan does help, but I think there's room for Retroid to improve the performance and fan curves in a future update. The screen was a huge concern for a lot of people because the units we all got had a green tint to them that was very noticeable. Retroid assured us that the retail units would not have this issue, and we all received an LTE update that fixed it. While this is a software fix, I think the results are great, and comparing it to the original 3 Plus screen, the colors look better in my opinion. And taking a look at the Odin 2 screen, I think it holds up pretty well. I saw a lot of comments about the resolution not being 1080, but at this size I don't really think it matters. That's not to say it's perfect. There are some things that I feel could have been better, like the new bezels being slightly thicker. The actual display area is the same, but the side bezels are just a little bit thicker. There's also a strange purple ghosting effect when rapidly scrolling menus with white text. This doesn't happen in any game, so don't worry about that. It's just in the menus, and I'm not sure if this is just something Android 13 is doing here, but it is there. And arguably a bigger screen would have been nice, but that would have required a whole redesign and would have hurt the Pocket ability. Moving on to software, the 4 Pro runs Android 13, and it's a very clean build with no real bloatware. That's another area Retroid does well. We never really have to worry about the OS with them. So it's your standard build of Android with some additions for gaming like a performance setting, fan modes, and a side menu showing you statistics and a key mapper. We've seen this mapping function before in other Retroid handhelds, and it's one of my favorites because it's simple to use. You just select your input, drag it over, touch the area you want, press the button, and save. You can also adjust the behavior of the sticks for things like camera control, aiming, MOBAs, all that just by tapping the joystick. You can also adjust the opacity if you don't want them floating all over the place. Back in the Android home screen, we can also access the Retroid launcher, which is just a built-in launcher with no frills that turns your device into more of a console experience with controller navigation in mind. It just simplifies it, and if you want to use this as a docked console, it's going to be a lot easier to navigate everything that way versus just using your standard home screen. You can also load your own launchers, but for me personally, I've kind of gotten away from doing that, and I just prefer launching things straight from the home screen. Lastly, we have the handheld settings that you can find in the Android settings. Here you can adjust things like power saving, docking options, input styles, calibration, rerun the setup wizard, even reset the device. You're definitely going to want to take a look in this area because swapping the input styles is very useful for Android games. Now let's take a look at the part everybody actually cares about, Android gaming. We can push Genshin Impact to high settings 60 FPS, but I didn't really see much of a visual difference and I prefer keeping it at medium settings with the performance profile. If you really want to maximize battery life, you can try dropping all the settings to low and locking the frame rate to 30, but I think medium at 45 is a great compromise for quality and longer battery life. Diablo Immortal runs in high settings 60 FPS in performance mode with a quiet fan profile. The great thing about this game is it has native controller support so everything maps correctly. Finally, we'll take a look at Call of Duty Mobile, and this game also runs at high settings 60 FPS with the performance quiet settings. The cool thing is, if we go to handheld settings and change our controller over to Xbox mode, we get native controls. You still have to use a touch for some things like menu navigation, but it's a much better experience. Moving on to emulation, we're going to skip all of the systems from Dreamcast on down except for Saturn, because that one keeps coming up and it's a tricky one to run. Every other system will work upscaled with no real issues, so I don't want to drag this section on more than I have to. But before we get into it, let me just say this is not a 100% plug and play system for PS2 and Gamecube games. You will need to adjust some settings to get the best performance possible, as well as to just get some games playable. That being said, this is a decently powerful handheld and it'll handle a huge amount of those systems libraries. So let's get into it and see what it can do. First up, we have the Sega Saturn, and luckily we have more than enough power to handle these games at least 720p with no frame skips. Now, I'm not the most cultured Sega Saturn connoisseur, as in I've never touched one because I grew up with Nintendo, but I'm slowly coming around. Now, while the power is there, I still had some issues with RetroArch not launching my games. Maybe it's because I'm using CHD files, I'm really not sure, but most likely it's just a user error. So I ended up using Java Sanshiro Pro 2. For the most part, everything ran full speed with no frame skips using the standard performance mode with no fan. But even then, I still had some issues like games not opening randomly only to work perfectly fine after closing everything. Once I got in the game, it was a good experience and it was nice to see these games running so smooth, or at least as smooth as the Sega Saturn game can run.
You mean go into the house? Isn't that bad manners? Okay, fine. You stay out here with your man.
3DS is pretty good. A lot of the popular games like Mario 3D Land and Pokemon Ultra Sun will work at a 2 to 3x resolution using the standard power settings with no fan. Some minor slowdowns still happen when caching shaders, and you have to play around with the graphics backend for some games. I've mostly stuck to Vulkan because games occurring of time have graphical issues and Vulkan fixes most of them. But the performance takes a hit in some areas, mostly cutscenes. Other games like Donkey Kong Country play better with OpenGL, so you'll have to play around with it. It comes down to the emulator development and the compatibility, not really a lack of power. A lot of the library is playable though, and luckily Citra has been getting a lot of attention, so things should get better soon. Gamecube works great because we have plenty of power and analog triggers, but let me just repeat this, some games like Rogue Squadron won't work right, but if you go in and adjust some settings here and there, you can get the majority of games running at a 2 to 3x resolution, full speed, using NTSC ROMs. Keep in mind, we're asking a mobile chip to run software it was never intended to run, so tinkering will be needed. Since we have 8 gigs of RAM, we can actually use HD textures on some games like Wind Waker to really enhance the visual experience. For these, we really do need the 8 gigs of RAM because these use a lot of memory. For Wind Waker, I'm running at a 2x resolution using 4H textures, and it'll use between 60 to 90% memory depending on where you go. On Windfall Island, we can see the performance is solid with no slowdown and the game looks great. Even when there's a lot of weather effects, we're able to maintain a solid frame rate. If you ever emulated this game, you know the Forest of Fairies is a hard area and has big frame drops, but here I'm still getting a solid frame rate with minor dips in performance mode with a quiet fan. In general, GameCube performance is solid and I'm sure you'll be able to play most of your favorite games. Wii performance is solid, but keep in mind, the controller layout can be an issue, so you're going to have to get creative with mapping inputs. Luckily, people have been trying to emulate Wii for years, and you can find some great ideas on how to make games work. Or you could just do what I do and stick to the games that support the classic controller. It's easy to find a list of games that support this online, and that's usually the best way to go. Other than that, a lot of games work with minor adjustments, but just like GameCube, not every game will. I think everyone's the most excited for this part because we've wanted a handheld that can realistically handle PS2 games, but can also fit in our pocket. And the Pro is about as close as we've gotten. I say close because the reality is not every game is going to work, and it's not really a fault of the handheld or a lack of power. PS2 emulation on Android is no longer being developed, and compatibility starts to become a problem. I'm using Nether SX2 since it's based on the latest Aether SX2 build, and some games like Side Cooper get stuck at 10% speed no matter what settings I change. But it works if you use Aether SX2 3668. It would be great if you can install both, but for now, it's one or the other. Now that being said, it's a really good PS2 handheld and it will handle a lot of the more popular games at 2x resolution in performance mode with the quiet fan settings.
Commencing combat.
This is the final system we're going to take a look at, and while the 4 Pro is not a handheld you should get if you want to play Switch games, it can still handle a decent chunk. It's mostly going to be the easier to run indie games and some lighter 2D and 3D games running at a sub 1x resolution, but the fact that we can get so many games working is pretty cool, and just speaks to the amazing job the Yuzu team is doing. One thing to keep in mind is that Switch emulation can pull a lot of power, and you're going to be using the high performance setting, so your battery life is going to take a big hit. But if you want to play some indie games or read some visual novels, you can squeeze a decent amount of playtime, and you'd be surprised how many games are actually playable. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is an amazing little machine that packs a lot of power. It's going to be interesting to see how the market responds to such an aggressive proposition of price to performance. The fact that you can get so many GameCube and PS2 games running makes this a valid option for somebody looking for a device for those systems, as long as they understand the limitations of the chipset and that it isn't a device that can compete against something like the Odin 2 or x86 devices like the Steam Deck or ROG Ally. As of right now, nothing on the market can compete at this price. Sure, there's some things that need to be addressed, but Retroid is great at continuing support, and it looks like once again they have a winner on their hands. 2024 is off to an amazing start, and I can't wait to see what else we get this year. That's gonna wrap it up. I hope this video was informative and that you enjoyed it. There's 3 of us on the channel, so every video is a little different, but we do our best to bring you quality content. If you want to hang out with us, you can always find us on Discord, and we go live on here all the time. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and helps us bring you more videos like this. Thanks for hanging out. I'll see you on the next one.